Hello, I'm Carlo Gébler, and I'm here today on behalf of the Irish Cultural Centre in Hammersmith in London, England, the world, Europe, the world. As part of its remit, the ICC, the Irish Cultural Centre, provides a platform for Irish authors to launch and promote and discuss their work. While the ICC enjoys showcasing established authors, it's very, very keen also to encourage and support new and emerging Irish writers. The format of this online series consists of an established author, allegedly that's myself, talking to, introducing and interviewing an emerging writer, although I think it would be fair to say this is your second novel that we're going to discuss, The Colony. You've emerged. For this, the sixth interview in the series, I'm delighted to be speaking to Audrey Magee about her novel, The Colony, her second novel, which was published by Faber earlier this year, 2022.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm delighted to talk to you. I'm looking
Hello.
forward to our chat. Hi.
Hi, nice to see you.
Likewise.
I suppose the first thing to do would be to ask you to explain the setup. Man, painter, boat, island, etc., etc. Just give us a little 2-minute.
Okay, so the novel, the second novel, as you say, is called The Colony, and it's the second part in a triptych I'm doing on I suppose the ordinary person and its interaction with major political systems. So in this novel, The Colony, I have an Englishman, an artist called Mr. Lloyd. We only ever know him as Mr. Lloyd. We never find out what his first name is. And he takes a curragh on to a remote Irish-speaking island in the summer of 1979. And he takes this curragh because he wants to have the authentic experience of being a person going to the island. Not so much being an islander, because he knows he's not an islander, but he wants to experience what it is to be an islander. And he's going there to paint. And he goes there and he's happy as a lark because he's got the island to himself. He doesn't speak Irish, but that doesn't really bother him. He has ways of communication. Some of the people on the island are bilingual. He's happy there and he's content there because he has the island to himself. But then a Frenchman, Jean-Pierre Masson, arrives onto the island. But he's a regular visitor because he's a French linguist and he's studying the demise of the Irish language. And he has been studying this particular family on the Irish island for the previous 4 summers. And he is utterly horrified to find an Englishman on the island, an English speaker on the island. So the two men really, they end up like two bulls in the field, always clashing and always clashing. One of them always wants to be dominant and one of them wants to be friends with the island and the other one just wants the island to himself. But basically it's through their conflict that seeps then into other conflict on the island that I suppose I discuss and I consider and I analyze what it is to be colonized and what it is to be the colonizer. So it's through these relationships on this tiny island, it's 3 miles long and half a mile wide, that we look at this whole legacy of colonization and its impact on language, its impact on sex, its impact on day-to-day relationships, its impact on power struggles and power controls. And yeah, so it's that really.
You said that this is the second novel, which is part of a triptych. Is your first novel, The Undertaking, the first part of that triptych?
Yeah, so the first novel, The Undertaking, looks at fascism and the ordinary person. And the ordinary person in this case was the ordinary German soldier and a woman he married while he was on the Eastern Front. And I create that framework. They didn't know each other and they engaged in this marriage to kind of escape war, but also to latch onto something during war. Because I wanted to, again, explore the impact of fascism and what it was like to be an ordinary person during that time, and what were the implications of that, again, that incredibly hierarchical structure on the ordinary person, and what they do to, I suppose, endorse it and support it. Because, you know, we grew up with this kind of notion of Germany as this very strange place, you know, that it was full of people who were determined to be fascists, you know, and that would be kind of the depiction in British and American films, that, you know, that they were all Nazis, they were all. But when I went there, when I lived there, you realize it's actually much more complicated. And in that silence, it's, well, we all have this potential to be just sucked in by a political system. And then you realize that, well, in Ireland, we were sucked into a political system that we didn't quite understand either. And that was colonialism. How do we come out from under that, you know, and how do we in Ireland think of ourselves as colonized? And well, actually, we don't really consider that kind of day-to-day impact of those, I suppose, the impact on our language, the impact on our interactions, the impact of you know, when Henry VIII literally divided the country into Catholic and Protestant, into Irish speaker and English speaker. What's the legacy of that on us? And, you know, and that filters into actually everything we do without even understanding it. It filters into our relationship with our religion. It filters into our relationship with our language. So how do you unpick that? So I suppose, yes, I'm very interested in these major political systems and the ordinary person.
The book is set on an Irish-speaking island where there are now some bilingual, i.e. Irish and English-speaking people, and there are the island has its hierarchies. But before we go into the Irish side of the book, it also has another colonial context. So the linguist, the philologist, the man who was studying, JP, he is the product. He has certainly been affected by, profoundly, though in an unusual way, the war that raged in Algeria between 1952 and the Treaty of Evian, 1961, I think. The war that went on between the French state and the FLN. Tell us about Monsieur Masson's unusual heritage and what it's done to him, because that's such an important part of the book.
Yeah, so it is an exploration of colonization, and it is an exploration of, as I said earlier, what it is to be colonized and what it is to be the colonizer. And to do that, I didn't want to just talk only of Ireland, because actually it's such a huge international issue that we are now, I'm a very slow writer, but as it turns out, as this book emerges, it is such a huge current issue of how to deal with the legacy of colonialism. And what I decided to do was actually just draw comparisons between what happened in Ireland and what happened in Algeria. Because so much of what happened here in Ireland was replicated. So Ireland, when King Henry VIII and then Elizabeth I introduced the systems of, sorry for that.
It's all right. I get my Elizabeths mixed up as well.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, Elizabeth I, his daughter, when they introduced these structures that that they were the template of modern colonialism that were then exported all around the world. So the French took up this system of ruling, creating these structures, as the British did, of introducing legal, educational, trading systems that all had to be done through English or through French, as the case may be. And once they did that, once they brought language and law into it, they actually created incredibly difficult structures for people without these languages to live, to survive, to function. So therefore, everybody had to start learning English or learning French or learning Spanish if you were down in South America. So the language was a huge weapon of the colonizer. And I wanted, through Masson, through this linguist, through JP, to actually join the dots, if you like, of actually just how systematic it was. So Masson, JP, his full name is Jean-Pierre Masson. He's JP to the Islanders. JP is, his father was French. He had been a soldier in France, in Algeria, and met JP's mother. And then the mother went back with him to France. But she went back thinking, she joined him in France thinking she was now going to be French, but met this incredible barricade of, well, no, you're not French, you're Algerian. And even within her in-laws. So she ended up very isolated. So JP takes with him to this Irish-speaking island this sense of being the outsider, because he wasn't Algerian, but he wasn't French, and he wanted to be French, and terrible things happened within his family over this identity and over which language is going to be used, and very similar to what happened here. But he brings that with him to this Gaeltacht region, to this Irish-speaking island. And we draw comparisons, and we, as the reader, as the writer, as the reader, we start to just realize how systematic and similar and replicated the impact was of when you start to use language as a weapon, and when you start to use, obviously we know law is used as a weapon all the time, but just language as a weapon, it's an incredibly powerful force. And we look at that through the novel, through using the Irish language, the Arabic language, French and English. So they all this kind of mélange, a little bit of Latin in there too. But this kind of mélange in the book of all these different colonial languages, in terms of those that were used to exert power and those that were, I suppose, sidelined by the colonizer.
But the sort of unhappy history or the unhappy relationship between Algeria and France, the bad relationship, the failed relationship, has a psychological impact. JP, as the islanders call him, living in France as a young boy with his mother, is wanted by his mother to learn Arabic and acquire some understanding of the Quran. She's not necessarily proselytizing, if I understand correctly, but would like him to know something about, well, certainly the culture that she comes from. And he rejects that. And so as you're reading the book, you find yourself thinking, at least if you're me, that his immersion in the Irish language is a kind of act of atonement. It's a way of making up to his mother. We invent these systems of atonement. I mean, what the mother would make of this, who knows? But in his mind, he is, by studying Irish and by in his own way trying to preserve its integrity and its purity, he's on that side. He's sort of doing something for he's repairing something within his own personal history, as well as doing something for a country, Ireland, a place, the island, that he's come to quite like in his own way.
Yeah, he's doing all of that. But I would argue he is also enhancing. Yes, he is atoning, but he is also benefiting. So his mother inculcated in him a huge understanding of language and linguistics. There's no question of that. And he's challenged by Lloyd, well, why aren't you off, in Algeria saving those languages? Why are you here saving this one? And that's absolutely a huge part of the book, that, well, why isn't he? But to some degree, it was an easier way to be French, not to go off back to Algeria, but to go off to remote Irish-speaking Ireland, because that has credibility and status in the French university systems of the time, that really Arabic and Bedouin or any of those other languages that you might find in Algeria, well, it wouldn't have had it, and it didn't have it. So in fact, yes, he was atoning, but also he was using too. Like he was atoning on the one hand and enhancing his own status on the other. So he's this complicated character, because it's not straightforward. Because I think if you grow up with this duality that he had, and this, very divided sense of loyalties, conflicted loyalties, it's very hard to come out of it in an easy and straightforward way. So yeah, I think he's still trying to find his way. I don't think he has his way, actually, even though he's on the cusp of getting his doctorate, and he imagines his professorship and everything else that will come of it. I don't think it's necessarily that he's gone off to the island to save this language and is doing a great thing for the islanders. I would argue that actually he still inherited a bit of the colonial usage.
Oh, I didn't mean that it necessarily will be efficacious, but I have the feeling that he believes it will be efficacious.
Oh, for him it's efficacious,
yeah.
No question of it. But whether or not it actually is, as a reader and a writer of it all, I have my doubts.
Well, some of the islanders are even skeptical about what it is that he will achieve. Is he exploiting the island, JP?
See, a lot of people haven't read this book yet, so I feel very bad talking about I mean, he has that complicated relationship where he is trying to get them to see what's precious, which he believes the Irish language is very precious. So on the one hand, he's trying to save it, but on the other hand, is he saving it for them, or is he saving it for himself and his own needs and his own doctoral thesis? Like, so for whom, does he care once he's off the island with all that he needs in his bag? On his tape recorder, does he care what happens to the language, or is it just, and I have a mixed bag of emotions about Masson. I mean, I think he is trying, but sometimes he tries in a cack-handed way, and then other times, he theoretically as a linguist, he's an observer. But he wasn't an observer. He made himself a player. And I suppose that's where he crossed the line. He did things on the island, particularly towards the end of the novel that we won't talk about, that he became a player. And that's not the job of the role. That's not the theoretical and academic role of a linguist.
No, he gets himself mixed up.
He does.
Is Mr. Lloyd his sparring partner, perhaps, or they're shadows of each other, the painter? Is he exploiting the island, painting it and painting its people and interacting with its people?
So I remember I was a long time ago in Pakistan, and I went to take some photographs, and really people got very upset if I took photographs of women, because I was taking their image and I was taking what belonged to them, and what belonged to whom. Who owned it, I don't know, but certainly it was not for me to take. So different cultures have different interpretations of what can be given and what can be taken. So I do definitely look at that and analyze that. And it's a very interesting thing as to who owns what, who owns an island's image, the island's image of itself, and then the people on the island. Who does that belong to? And there is a big debate in the book, because he forms this relationship with Mairead, who is this beautiful young widow woman on the island, who should theoretically, she has a 15-year-old son. She's theoretically an independent person who can decide whether or not she wants to pose for him, which she decides to do. And he feels that he is enabling her. she feels she's been enabled by him, but the islanders don't necessarily view it that way. Some of the islanders don't view it that way. So is he using them? Yes, I mean, I think we talked to Colin Tabine earlier. I mean, Colin Tabine talks of writers being monsters in that they use everything. I think artists use, that's their job, is to take what they can. But is he using in a colonizing way, or is he using in an artist's way? Is there a difference? And if there is a difference, is he walking that line? And I think he too ends up getting involved in different ways, slightly to Masson, but where he crosses boundaries. And I think both those men who come from colonizing countries come with one agenda, and it's of itself, they're quite respectable things to do. One, to record the language; the second, to paint the cliffs. But it becomes more complicated when they allow themselves to become players, and when they see themselves as having a role on the island and a part to play on the island and a way to control the island. And I think that's where they both fall foul, if you like, is that they don't come doing what they say they were doing, which is actually on the face of it quite acceptable. But they continue this legacy of landing into a place and trying to own it and manage it and run it and create it in the way they want it to operate, and that's where they fall foul, I think. So that's where they become takers, is they might, when they arrived ostensibly, if they had done what they said they were going to do, would they have ended up replicating the patterns of the colonizer? Probably not. But because they reached boundaries, then they replicated the patterns.
I mean, Mr. Lloyd is he's not a constant or consistent person. He's not an honourable person. That's how he came across to me. And he's a person who lets people down. But he's also a person, and you explained this very carefully, who is himself wounded. He feels his art, and there's a fantastic sense of art in the book, which is always a difficult thing because books are in words, not pictures, that his art is perhaps unwanted, unwelcome. He has a connection to the art world through his wife, who has a sort of curatorial, galleristic function and is much more, well, she's in a different field, but much more successful than him, or much more modern. And she judges his art in his lights unkindly. So he's, like Masson, he's also psychologically very acutely drawn. That's what I'm trying to say. So yes, there are these historical elements in play, but there's also human psychology in play, and people do things, behave badly for reasons that are perfectly explicable because of their character.
Yeah, well, both men want to prove themselves, so both men for different reasons. Masson wants to prove himself because he wants to get a toehold in French society that has thus far eluded him. And Lloyd wants to prove to his wife, ex-wife, half-wife, that he is relevant, that his art is relevant, that he is not old-fashioned, that he can create new and exciting works. She's much more engaged with the London art scene than he is. He's an outsider in it because there's such a surge and interest in modern art, and he's out on this remote rock doing landscapes. Nobody's interested in landscapes. Photography has taken over. He's just not relevant. But he's trying to make himself be relevant. And both these men want to get off the island as success stories.
Yeah.
So
it's their launch pad.
Yeah, it's their launch pad. So,
Mm.
you know, as I said earlier, if they had stuck to the knitting, there is knitting in the book, but I mean, if they had stuck to what they went to do, um, they they might have left with everybody's dignity intact, but they didn't.
Mm.
And they pushed boundaries for self-aggrandizement.
Mm.
And yes, some of it was because of because they could, because they came with the status of the great colonizer. So that, you know, I think it's very interesting to see like how a person from Britain or Ireland, Britain or France lands onto an Irish island, you know, and
Mm.
they land differently to an Irish person onto an Irish island, or probably, you know, somebody from a different country, because they have this history and legacy of landing places and owning them.
Mm.
And I think that gives an innate sense that these two men carry, even if they don't know they carry it, they have they have a history of it, a legacy of it that they grew up with. And they mightn't necessarily be superficially aware of it, but they are latently aware of this legacy and this experience and this kind of sense of being the top dog, you know. And they take that, but they are both of them bringing their baggage onto the island,
Mm.
and that complicates it, and that um, brings it, as you say, from just being the political into the personal. But that's where the personal meets the political, and the clashes
Mm.
become
Mm.
more, I think,
Mm.
interesting because they are so complicated. But then I think it is very hard to I suppose extrapolate one from the other. You know, it's very hard to live in just a political vacuum or just a personal vacuum. And that's the thing where that I like to explore in my work, is that those kind of crossover points, you know, where the personal and political impact on each other.
Mm. So, on the island, there are some people, the people who interact with JP and Mr. Lloyd, 4 generations. And they have, who are these 4 generations, and what did the different generations make of these visitors?
So three of those people, it's a long, Masson, JP is studying 4 generations of the one family and the Irish as it changes over the 4 generations. The oldest member of his study is a woman called Banny Flynn, and she sits up in her house beside the fire with her pipe and her shawl, and she's very much like the Peg figure that we would have met, some of us would have met in school. Now, I was a big Peg fan. I was a closet Peg fan. You know, I just adored Peg, but you couldn't say you liked Peg because you were dead if you said you liked Peg, because that was just, you know, it was just most people just despised what she talked about and despised what she stood for. I just loved Peg because she was this woman who, if you like, embodied this very simple but very harsh island life, and it was very much linked to the landscape, linked to the earth, linked to the sea, and that's what Banny Flynn is. So she is like the old, and she's the only Irish speaker, pure Irish speaker.
And when we say Peg, we're talking about Peg Sayers, who's the Blasket Island oral writer, narrator, storyteller. I think whose work was it written down by her son or by Robin Flower? Robin Flower.
So Robin Flower was an Oxford University linguist who went to the Blasket Islands and gathered stories, but also gathered the language. So it's quite interesting, you know, it's quite interesting the history of linguistics on the Irish islands. Sorry, we'll get back to the women in a second, but we just have a little segue here. Because when the Irish state was founded, there was a huge interest in Irish music and Irish folklore. But there wasn't so much interest in linguistics and language per se. A lot of those gatherers of that language and linguistics came from Oxford. So a lot of Oxford students came to the islands and came to the west of Ireland to gather fragments of the language, and one of those was Robin Flower. So he would like JP in the book, he brought a tape recorder and he recorded the speakers of the language. So his principal character was Peg Sayers, and JP's principal character here, you know, in this book is Banny Flynn. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I very much wanted to replicate that sense of history, the history of linguistics and the history of gathering, that it is an external person who comes onto the island to gather the linguistic history and the linguistic patterns as they're happening on the island. So Banny Flynn is the only pure Irish speaker, and she, even if she does understand any English, she has nothing to do with the language. She's quite stubborn on the matter. And then her daughter is Banny Neal, and Banny Neal would be, if you like, a passive English. She would have a passive understanding of English, but doesn't speak it at all. And then her daughter is Mairead, and Mairead is the young, beautiful widow on the island, and she would have some English, but doesn't until further in the book. We don't know that, and she doesn't use it. And then her son is James, and he is fully bilingual. He went to school on the mainland, and he's now back on the island. He's a 15-year-old who's unhappy in school, but he is the main link, if you like, between the islanders and Mr. Lloyd, the English artist. So they form a relationship. But those are the 4 generations. But he is the only male left on the island, because his grandfather, father, and uncle were killed in a fishing tragedy on a boat. They drowned, and so there's an awful lot of pressure on him to be the provider for these 3 generations of older women. But he doesn't want that. He wants to practice art. He wants to go with Lloyd. He wants to be like Lloyd, or definitely to be something else rather than a fisherman. Mm. So yes, so this is what the 2 men, when they land on the island, this is what they're landing into. They're landing into these 4 generations who are really very impoverished and very dependent on these 2 men, which is another part of the problem, is that this dependency and tolerance of this behavior of the English, the Englishman, the Frenchman, because really they don't have any choice. They have to, they need this summer money to get through the winter, and then the subsequent pressure on James to support these 3 women.
Mm. Because the 2 visitors rent. That's how money transfers hands. But I think the house, or maybe both the houses they're actually owned by another brother who's gone to Boston, I think.
That's right.
Or America. So you also have, hovering on the edge of the book, this idea of the way in which not just the Irish-speaking world, but in your case, the Irish-speaking world is also being dislocated by immigration, and this thing of people go away, but they still have property, and the money is, everything is becoming more and more complicated and global. That's
yeah. And you're also into, like, if you like, a new generation of landlords, but they're Irish, you know, which is kind of just yeah.
So the young male James is actually Seamus, though he insists on being called James. And one of the great pleasures of the book is seeing him interacting with Mr. Lloyd. It's a painful encounter, because Mr. Lloyd is a very obdurate person. He's blunt. He's not very charming, really. I suppose he has his flinty integrity, and it's also very interesting seeing how the generations but particularly, because seeing how Mairead, mother of Seamus / James, also relates to Mr. Lloyd. And through Mairead, we also encounter another aspect of Ireland, and that is the Troubles. because the book is called The Colony, set on the island. You arrive with Mr. Lloyd, the events occur, you leave. It's almost theatrical. It takes place, it observes the unities, takes place over a summer. In 1979, it's very, very exact. The weather, changing season, time moving on. And every now and again, you cut away. You cut away to something and you report it, something that's happened in the north or Northern Ireland. And it's reported, it's like a sort of at-gay photograph. It's, here's a killing. This is right, this man did, yeah, blah, 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 blah. Very brutal, very blunt. And these keep feeding in as you go through. And you think, oh, as you're reading, right, okay, so of course, this is going on in parallel. Here is another consequence of colonialism. This is a leftover. This is what, partition created this. But then you get not direct, well, yes, almost direct. You get the commentary, particularly of Mairead and her interaction with other men on the island about what's going on. And her take is extremely uncharacteristic. It's not what you expect. She's not singing from either the Republican or the Nationalist hymn sheet, is she?
No, I think she's
singing from the human hymn sheet.
She's a humanist and a mother of a 15-year-old son who, if this goes wrong, it could be him involved, or, she's in this very fragile space where her son has no future. And she's very aware of the troubles and how they're sucking in young boys and young men, just like her son is coming into being. So she's but she's also a very empathetic human character, and she's also herself. She's she has a very strong sense of herself and a very strong sense of her agency and of who she is on the island and why she is on the island. And it's, she knows what she's about. So therefore, I believe she has space to actually consider the humanity of these killings and the impact. So, she very much, when she hears a radio report of what happened, she very much sees it from the perspective of the widowed woman or the children left behind, because she has been left behind. She's lost her husband, her father, and her brother, all in one go. So she knows what it means to just have everything taken from you in a really violent moment. That's it. It's all over. And the thing she wants to protect is her son from ever losing him as well. And so she's threatened by it, while also she's empathetic. She's also feels just, this has to stop. And it's kind of, what I wanted to explore was the impact of that violence, that kind of drumbeat of violence on us. Now, I'm not talking, I really do not equate the experience of those of us who are in the South with anything that happened to those in the North. But there was that kind of, that daily, sometimes drumbeat of another killing, another event, another moment that we just, as children, as teenagers, we had to absorb into our day and into our lives. And I suppose she represents that. She represents that, trying to soak in that shock of that, because when you are that little bit distant from it, you can engage with a little bit more of the humanity, I think. So she is that. She is also at that little bit of a distance, struggling with the reality of it and the human cost of it.
The novel takes place on the island, and you cut away to these accounts of certain killings over the summer of 1979. And the book ends with the killing of Gabriel Wiggins on the 12th of September. And that's the last, as I say, that's the last thing, that's the final page. And I'm curious to know why that's the card you play last. Yeah,
so the killings are all written in the present tense. So the narrative the main narrative is past tense. Everything that happens on the island is past tense, but everything that happens in Northern Ireland or in Sligo or in Cork, which is Waterford, sorry, where all the killings have happened, are all written in the present tense. Because I feel it's something that still lingers on in us. And I end with Gabriel Wiggins because that's the part that still lingers on in us. You know, that it's in the present tense, it's still on us, in us. Those of us who grew up with it as a pulse, as a drum beat, as a rhythm, it's still in us. You know, we mightn't know their names, we mightn't know, and we mightn't even think about them. But that's the point of this book, is that like these latencies that are in us that we just don't even think about or understand. But they like we see Lloyd and JP arrive on the island with their baggage. We go around and the impact of that baggage. Well, we go around with that baggage and we don't really check it out and look at it and say, well, what's that actually doing to me? What's that doing to my relationship with my kids? What's that doing to my relationship with, you know, the Irish, if you like, political structure? And it's very hard, you know, to kind of consider this unless you unpick the impact of that violence and those killings. So that's why it's present tense, and that's why it's the last thing we deal with, because actually that's what we still need to deal with.
We have that latency in us.
Yeah.
The book is also unusual. You talked about the kind of the accounts of murders being present and the book being in the past tense. It's also typographically, the typology of the book is interesting because you don't use inverted commas, and sometimes things are paragraphed, that they're indented, sometimes they're not. It's the way in which the words are organized on the page is, you know, like Roddy Doyle, you've invented your own system of notation, which is, you know, Magee. It'll be a new kind of font, Magee font. And the undertaking, your previous book, which is more the type of it's more. I don't mean this critically. It's just descriptive. It's more conventional. Yeah. So why did you do this? Why did you organize the way in which language is deployed on the page in a completely unique way?
So when I was writing The Undertaking, it was obviously my first novel, and I was writing it as, if you like, as a kind of a Bildungsroman, you know, a kind of development of a character, but it was kind of a development of me too. You know, I was building, I was growing, I was developing. But because they were ordinary Germans in the book, who were, if you like, hugely repressed by the system around them, there wasn't a lot of latitude for me as a writer. You know, they had to be confined because they actually couldn't allow themselves to look out and consider what they were doing, because they would fall apart and break apart. So I had to keep it to a very tight, simple, conventional piece to some degree, because obviously it was my first book, but also because that was what the book required. It required to be a very simple space to consider actually quite difficult things. And you know, the second novel, it was I suppose more me as a writer in that it was I had the linguist and the artist, so I could immediately start to play with ideas. But then actually to play with this, once I started to write Lloyd, it was like trying to write from the perspective, trying to see the world as an artist sees the world. So then I started to play with this, with him seeing himself in it. So it's self-portraits, and once you start to see, I started to see him as a self-portrait, I started to see him as part of the language. But then because they're all contained on this very small space, I actually started to feel like, well, it's a bit like, you know, it's the sea coming in and them going out, and can I create that in language? And it's kind of a constantly fluidly moving thing, because they are all moving and developing and shifting, and like the sea itself. So to some degree, I hope the novel reflects that kind of constant movement of the sea and of through language, that it's just, I tried to write to suit the book. So I wrote the undertaking to suit the undertaking. I wrote the colony to suit the colony. And yeah, it's a period of great change and great evolution on this tiny island. So the language had to represent that and break spaces and break into different ways of doing things, so we could actually stand back, look at what is latent, look at what can change, look at what is changing, and look at the impact of things. So yeah,
that makes complete sense. So that the language and the way things are organized and deployed has a kind of maritime systole, distole.
Yeah, there's a fluency
in and out
to it.
Fluency.
You're just and you can't, this is one of the things I just really adore doing. Was there are 4 people with internal monologues, and they're very different. So I had a little discussion with myself as I was writing. So does internal monologue have a national identity? And how do they speak to themselves? So we know because of Proust, we have that very defined way of French internal monologue. And then because Lloyd was going onto an Irish-speaking island, his was more fractured. He's more fractured as a person, but he's the Englishman going into an Irish space. So his language had to represent that. So the language came to represent the people, and Lloyd, Mairead and James are an amalgam of both. Sometimes they're fractured because they haven't quite found themselves, but yet sometimes they're very fluent and fluid because they're at home. But it all weaves from one and rolls from one to the other, from internal monologue back out to island life, back in again. And and it is like they're all rolling on the sea and rolling on the waves and rolling.
Yes, because another noticeable stylistic device is that you just cut, so to speak, into the internal monologues. You suddenly arrive inside and then you're outside. You're ingested and then you're spat out. You're back in the outside world. And yes, that has a kind of, that has incredible fluency. I'd like to go back to Mr. Lloyd for a moment. I was very struck by the way in which I certainly had a sense of both the paintings that he produces and the paintings that Seamus James, the younger boy, produces. I'd like to have both of them in my house. And I also, my impression of Mr. Lloyd's art was that it was sort of, in my mind, it was sort of Rousseau-esque. It was figurative, but it was also a bit strange. This is late Rousseau, not early Rousseau, when he was a kind of different kind of painter. And I find, my impression is that I spend more time with Mr. Lloyd in the book than with JP. And I found him really obnoxious. And I also felt quite sorry for him. When he leaves the island, I thought, he's a person who doesn't really know how to, he doesn't know how to be in the world in a way that JP does. JP probably will get he'll probably be a professor and he'll, have a nice summer house in Brittany. It'll all be grand, really, I feel. And he's probably a perfectly decent bloke as well. But there's something self-sabotaging about Mr. Lloyd, as well as visionary. He's a very curious and interesting character.
So, what is it to be English? What is it to be Irish? What is it to be English? But I was trying to, I suppose, get the essence of Englishness in Ireland. And it's a complicated space, I think, Englishness in Ireland, because so many English people just love being in Ireland. They just really get on well with it. It works really well. And yet there's no matter how long they can be here, for many of them, there's still an outsider status. They could be here all their lives practically, but there's still kind of that kind of belonging but not quite belonging thing that goes on. And I wanted to create that through Lloyd, that kind of belonging but not quite belonging. Because in a way, like, he and the islanders actually understand each other in a way that's actually better than the way Masson or JP and the islanders understand each other. Like, there's a veneer of like, oh yeah, we all get on really well with JP. It's always great fun when he comes over and everything else. But they know JP is passing. They know he's just there for a reason. He's going to go. But there's a different relationship with Lloyd, and there is just inevitably a different relationship between us all on these islands, among us all on these islands, but between these islands is really what I'm trying to say. And I'm trying to pick up on that because it's at the essence of it all, actually, is this man who's certain that he has it all, and he's certain that he knows how to run this place, and he knows what he wants, and he knows everything, and he knows how to do it, and he knows what the islanders need, and he knows this, and he knows that. But then he's actually very fragile about it all. And I think that's something in not all English people, but because there's no way you can generalize as a novelist, you can't generalize, but just there are little patterns that you might see. And that'd be one of the patterns that I'm trying to pick up on, is this confidence, and yet this uncertainty. I'm not going to call it guilt. That's way too loaded. It's just a stupid word for this, but it's an uncertainty. It's a confidence, but it's also an uncertainty. It's a confidence of their place in Ireland, but not at all confidence of the place in Ireland. And it's that for me is what Lloyd is. Well, when the scene where he's there and he's really annoyed because he feels he's certain he's not getting the better treatment, and that's all going to Masson, to JP, and he's there, and he's certain that they put him in the house with the rot and the damp, and that it's guilt for it's his punishment for the famine, and it's his punishment for this and that and everything else, and that he's always going to be punished as the Englishman for what happened, and that he'll never get out from under that. So he's there, he's confident, but he's not really fully confident, but I don't think he is in London either. It's not that he's it's not that he's left London. He is, he's just, is he too late for, he doesn't fit in London because he's too old-fashioned, and he doesn't fit in on the island because he's too English. It's like, he's and I think that happens a lot to, say, the Protestant community up in Northern Ireland. They go to England expecting to fit in, but then they don't, and then they come to the south and they don't fit in there either. And there is a lot of dislocation among us, and then the Irish go to England and they think they're going to fit in and they don't, or they think they do fit in, but they only fit up to a certain point. There's just that sense among us of dislocation, and because he has come to this Irish island rather than tracking, say, James if he went to London, because you could probably write something similar of James' dislocation and not quite fitting in London. But at the minute we're dealing with Lloyd on the island. So it's trying to just that belonging, not belonging, certain of your place, but actually not at all certain of your place. Bodies.
I think I agree. I think the book catches that brilliantly. And I think the reason I feel sad for Mr. Lloyd is that my sense is his obtuseness and rudeness and bonkersness notwithstanding, the island made room for him, and they would have continued to make room for him. He doesn't understand that, and he lacks the if you come from England, you come to Ireland, it's a weird place, I'm sure, and there's a terrible history, but he can't sort out the evidence which is sort of hiding in plain sight of people's personal, the way people relate to him personally. Because actually, they take him in.
Mm.
I mean, he gets a kind of love, which he doesn't have. He's a loveless man, but he can't recognize it. You know, the nurturing and the way they get the second hut going for him, and they're concerned, does he get enough eggs? Does he get enough fish? It's old-fashioned mothering love. It's the love that keeps you going, keeps you alive. And he just doesn't know how to take it. And I found that all really telling and really interesting. And obviously, given the present moment in which we live, full of turbulence and all sorts of other things, prescient. So this is one of 3 books. And then there's a triptych. There's The Undertaking, and there's a 3rd book, and then you're going to put the 3 together, possibly in a slipcase.
Oh, definitely.
Definitely, beautiful slipcase, gold. And is one allowed to ask, what is your 3rd historical subject, or is that bad luck to talk about it?
Yeah, I don't talk about it. It's very private space. I find if they're private for the moment. They will be. I only ever talk about my work when it's finished. Anybody, editors, nobody.
But there will be a 3rd book that will kind of slot in with these other 2.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't set out. I set out to write 1 book, and then I finished that, and then I set out to write a 2nd book, and then it was only halfway through. I remember saying to somebody years ago, I'm going to write 3 books. That's it. I'm done. I'm writing 3 books. But what I didn't realize that actually it's a triptych. I was about halfway through this book. I said, oh my God, it's a triptych. That's what it is. And I had made a link in the first book. I made a link where the Peter Faber, the German man, says that he's after the war he's going to Ireland, because I knew I was going to Ireland. I knew, for me, the writer, that I was going to Ireland. And in this book I know where I'm going next, and it's in the 2nd book, but I can tell you.
It's all right. That's absolutely fine. We've been talking for an hour.
Have we? Well, I've loved it.
Thank you. My clock says 3:05, and I think we started at 2:05. Okay. Might have been 8 minutes past 2. Maybe it's a therapeutic hour, just slightly under the hour, to allow the psychoanalysts to just tidy up their notes, so to speak. With me as the psychoanalyst, perhaps, or perhaps you.
Yeah, who knows? I think it's a shared psychoanalysis. I think we did well together.
Yeah, shared shrinkage. Yeah. We're the better for it. Audrey Magee, on my behalf, on the ICC's behalf, on the listeners' behalf, on literature lovers' behalf, can I say thank you very, very much for doing this for us and talking to us so beautifully and fluently as the sea.
It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed every moment. Thank you.
Thank you.